morning. Good morning, everyone. It is such a joy to be here today for Talmud.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Good morning.
We are going to get started. Wes is still in Israel, so we're sending our love to him there, and we wanted to do some learning together here. Before we do our blessing, I just want to preface this by saying we all had a conversation and decided that we wanted to talk about parenting and grandparenting. And I looked around the room and realized I have exactly zero experience parenting or grandparenting. And all three of my colleagues have extensive experience. It's easy. So I was like sitting there thinking like, this is going to be interesting. And they're all talking about these ideas. And I was like, what can I do to get myself out of the conversation? So I'm going to be playing the role of Wes today and asking the question.
The only thing I can tell you is enjoy these moments.
And Elise, are you saying that Wes is into parents also?
No, but he's not here, so so we're gonna get started. Let's start with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam,
asher קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעסוק בדברי תורה. וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני, המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני, נותן התורה.
So there's a new show on Netflix called Working Moms. Has anybody seen it? There's this great scene that opens up. There's this mommy group, and all these mommies are sitting around on the floor with their babies. And one of the mommies says, I never would ever use the N word or the C word with my baby. And the other women are looking like, what? She was like, no or can't. I would never say no or can't. And so there's this, that scene is indicative of this new wave of what they call gentle parenting, which is the idea that each of us has to lift up our children, that the world is harsh, but you can build them up, and that everything they do is right somehow. And your job is to affirm their feelings and their experience and to lift them up. That's, of course, a backlash to earlier waves of parenting. So before we dive into Jacob and his parenting, I wanted to ask each of you how you developed your philosophy of parenting. How much is it based on the waves of the trends around you? How much was it based on the parenting that you grew up with? Was it based on books? How did you develop a philosophy? And if you have a philosophy, what is that?
Well, I was going to say that the hardest thing when we brought Emma home was between Sue and I deciding what our parenting style would be, because I was very much in line with how I grew up. You know, if you did something wrong, you know, Dad came home. The mom said, "Just wait till your father comes home," and and then Dad would come home, and my mother would say, "The boys were bad." So the immediate response was, you know, some kind of punishment, without even asking what was going on, without a conversation. That was just, I guess, that was the parenting style in the 50s. So so I said, well, that's the way that I think that we should proceed. And Sue said, what are you talking about? It's not going to work. You know, it has to be about conversation and learning. And yes, of course, there are going to be times where there's going to be time out and consequences and learning about consequences. But so oftentimes we would have these more than heated conversations about how we should proceed in certain styles, and we eventually worked out exactly how those going to work out.
Everything started now. So when I never thought about this, but naturally what I'm doing, and I've been doing for the last 17 and a half years, is the opposite of what my dad did. So my dad was more like Jacob. He was more like harsh, telling me and my brother, or my brother and I, the things we didn't do well. And I can never forget that I come from a family of cantors, and my grandfather was a cantor, my dad wasn't, But I remember vividly I was 15 or 16 and I sang Unetane Tokef in my synagogue. It was a small synagogue, didn't have a cantor, and I missed the high note at the end. But it was 3 hours of davening, and when I get off, my mom hugs me and kisses me and everything, and oh my God, I'm so proud. And my dad says, "What happened to that note? What happened to that high note?" And so in a way, I didn't like it. Obviously, I didn't like. My first reaction was, "Really? That's so bitter. That's the only thing you have to say." But eventually, it made me, be better at what was trying to do, be more like a perfectionist. I've been the opposite with my kids. I'm much more like easygoing, and it was easier to set the limits to the kids when they are little, as you perhaps know, because they don't have an argument. They don't have a whole argument to hit back to you at you. You tell them, don't do that. Don't put the fingers in the thing. And they said, oh, okay. But then it becomes a little hard. So that's the reason I have my wife, and she's the harsh one in the family, and so.
So I feel like we should have our children here to testify on our behalf. I was a perfect parent with a lovely parenting style all the way until I had children. And then I realized, one style is not going to work for each of your children. And I actually found I'm a very different parent with my different children. So some of them require one approach. My children famously have a complaint in that for all of them, the 3 older ones used to get time outs. We were very big on time outs. But when Benjamin was of the toddler age, I learned and discovered a new parenting philosophy, which was time ins. And time that what the children really needed was an embrace, and I would sit with him and I would hold him and he would get a time in, to which my older children think was the worst parenting philosophy that ever could have been implemented. And yet, I think, as parents, we learn and grow, and we're responsive to each children. One of the things that I particularly resonate to in Jacob's blessings of his children is not just the negativity there, but the fact that each child gets their own specific blessing that has to do with who each of those individual children are. And I think that's really important in our parenting, to try to be responsive to the child before you.
So, Michelle, can you take us there and take us to Jacob's blessing and share with us where you see, because I've always read these as just like the meanest thing to do, like the meanest thing to do at the end of his life. He's like, I'm going to leave you with an insult. Here you go. Yeah. Goodbye. So can you help me to see this in a better light?
Sure. No, and just like, to be honest, yes, that's totally there. There's a huge amount of negativity. There's a huge amount of what Elias's father was doing. You missed that high note. But by the way, did you ever miss that high note again?
No.
Never.
Until next high holidays.
Right, and so there is a take on these quote unquote blessings from Jacob, that this is about refining their spirit and helping them to reach a better place in their future, right? But when we look at it as modern people, let alone parents, it's pretty negative. It's pretty bad stuff. And yet, as I said, there is an individualist. He sees his children individually. So you want me to read? Yes, please. Okay. So Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather, and I will tell you what will happen to you at the end of days." By the way, there's a very messianic component to this.
I was also just going to say, it's the weirdest thing. He doesn't tell them what's going to happen at the end of days. This is a very interesting, and I don't know about this parental move, and I would love your wisdom on this. What is this? I'm going to tell you all the secrets of life. Just kidding. It's all about you.
Well, I think it's not just what will happen at the end of days to the children, but also to their tribes. In a sense, what he's seeing moving forward, and very famously when he blesses his grandchildren, There is a Rashi which talks about his prophecy that he sees that the younger child is going to have descendants, grandchildren, which will include, Joshua, who's going to lead the people into the promised land. And that's part of how he makes his blessings for the people, or at least rabbinically. There's some understanding that he's seeing not only the children in front of them, but their descendants and the way that they're going to be parents and grandparents and leaders of their tribes. Do you want me to continue?
Can you explain to me, Michelle, since you are, in a way, defending Jacob, can you explain to me verse 2?
Right.
The language used on verse 2?
Gather and listen, sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. So what's your question?
This is Jacob talking. It's like you saying, hey, Eli and Benjamin and sons of Michelle. Like, the guy is so full of himself,
Well, look, I think Jacob has this incredible interplay between the Jacob piece of him, which is that sort of lower, more human piece of him, and the Israel. And there's a piece that he's trying to say, this isn't just me talking as the guy who sits with you at the dinner table. This is kind of an epic gift. This is me as Israel, me as the one who's passing on the, don't look at me like that.
That's comparing exactly with you by saying, oh, you are the sons of Rabbi Michelle.
Well, so
we don't talk like that to our kids.
We don't talk like that to our kids, but I don't know that the biblical, and in this case, it's not just Jacob speaking, but sort of the biblical narrative in general, reminding us that this is the moment, not just Jacob sitting around with his children, but where the blessing from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gets passed on into the next generation of a spiritual legacy for the Jewish people, the Israelites. You're supposed to argue with that.
No, I think there's also this moment where, this is the end of Breshit. We're moving into, Parashat Shmo. We're moving into the whole next chapter of the Jewish people, and so this parsha is also kind of setting up, I think, in a certain way, the expectations of what's going to happen 400 or more years later after the slavery, that these tribes, which will kind of almost disappear in a certain way, will then re-emerge, and that their descendants will have the characteristics that the people of Israel have been blessed, or at least talked about earlier on.
Yeah. So I want to come back to this, and I have a question that I want to ask, which is, if we read verses 3 and 4. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, and the first of my might. You should have been superior in rank and superior in power.
What a blessing.
You have the restlessness of water, therefore you shall not have superiority. For you ascended upon your father's couch, then you profaned him who ascended upon my bed. Shimon and Levi are brothers, stolen instruments are their weapons. My question is this, as parents, right, we have two parenting styles that we're thinking about here. One is the gentle parenting, which would have been like, oh, I understand. You felt really a need, and you followed through on your need, and I can understand how you would do that. And could we think together about how we might rethink that approach? And then you've got the Jacob, which is like, you screwed up. And there's a whole range in between. My question for you as parents is, you serve a role of kind of what in Yiddish used to be called a Mummerbacher, right? That you're a memory book. You remember every moment of your children's lives. You've seen them all the way through. And so you have the advantage of knowing all of the missteps they've made and all of the successes they've made. What's the role of a parent in reminding a child of where they've missed the mark when it's years ago? And how do you see that as a healthy, do you see Jacob as doing this in a healthy way? Is this helping his children to become their best selves after he's gone? How would you understand that?
I think that we should make here a difference, because to me this is only, in theory, the blessing that Jacob is doing to his sons, okay? But it doesn't tell the whole picture. It doesn't tell the whole story, that perhaps he was a great and natural father, and then he never criticized his kids until this moment, okay? It could be, probably not, but it could be. And I'm wondering, I think you guys included this in the text. I'm wondering how much grit and how much resentment Jacob has for the sons, what they did to Joseph, and he was never able to forget that.
So, first of all, we're really lucky that we don't have to set up. We don't have sort of one blessing, most of us. You are going to be the one who takes on the family legacy. Jacob has, 12 children that up until then, it's just been a pair of brothers. Which one of you is going to get the spiritual legacy and pass it forward? Now he has to say which one of you is going to carry this spiritual legacy. And in a way, these blessings are all kind of, this is why you're disqualified, my child. But Elias, I want to pick up on what you said, because on page 3 at the bottom, there's the Mea Shiloach brings this really powerful pathos of Jacob, that when, why do you say that it's not just Jacob but Israel blessing you? Because Jacob himself didn't know if he wanted or needed or even could bless his children. He was still carrying around a lot of hurt from, as you see, from all the distress they caused him from selling Joseph. He couldn't bring himself into that moment. And how powerful when, many of us are lucky as parents that our children kind of do the things that one would hope children do. But sometimes children do things that break your heart and tear it apart. And what do you do in that moment? And that's where Jacob is. He's a parent who needs to say something to his children, but very much can't get behind the kind of people that his children chose to be. And so he maybe for all this time he's been kind of avoiding the subject, but now is the final time and he's got to tell them,
and in
this
addition,
is not
as
who I
we all
raised you to
know,
be.
in addition, as we all know, the first 11 kids are not from Rachel, which was in theory his most beloved wife, and perhaps he had a special place in his heart for the sons of Rachel.
Right, and in a sense, like the Mea Shiloach is coming and saying, look, at the end of your life, you've got to deal with those things. You've got to actually head on. Any scholar who doesn't, share, who doesn't tell the people in your life the real things that they need to hear is no scholar. You're not doing anyone favors by hanging on to something that you can't process through or can't work through with your children, even if it's hard.
The other question that comes up for me, Eliza, in light of what you're sharing too, is we have before him, right, Jacob's father, Isaac, clearly prefers Esau because Esau represents everything that he wasn't and would have been strong enough to not be bound at the altar and would have been a fierce warrior. Like, he has all of this love for Esau. And then we see in his final death scene that he just has, when Isaac was old and his eyes were too dim to see, he called his older son Esau and said to him, my son, here I am. I am old now and I don't know how soon I may die. Take your gear, right? Go out and get me this animal and I'll give you a blessing. There is zero interaction with Jacob. And my question is, as a parent, how do you manage that? For Jacob, Elias, you're talking about he had a preference for women, a preference for Rachel specifically. And so that preference spills out into the way he sees his children. And it may have been that they couldn't have done anything right because they just weren't from the right mother. And he was always bitter and resentful about that. But there are also qualities that I'm guessing, I'm not a parent, but I'm guessing you might see in your children at some point that are totally different than what you had imagined or totally different than what you had hoped for, or, spell it out in any different way. Kids come out the way they come out. They don't come out the way that you want them to come out necessarily. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, I think about, my dad desperately wanted one of us to take over his practice, and that's not going to happen. And we love him very much. We want to do the right thing by him, but that dream is never going to be fulfilled. So what do you do about that when your children aren't who you, what do you, or don't resemble what you imagined?
The other thing I was thinking about in terms of that's a really amazing question, and I think that one of the really hardest things to do as a parent is to let your children become who they are going to become. Giving them a role model, but not necessarily instructing them on what their life will end up looking like. And I think that's a really, really hard thing. The other thing to think about is and Elias, you think about this too, the complexity of the format of the formal blessing of a patriarch in ancient times, which is what we're following here. The language becomes poetic. It's not, when did Israel become a poet, right? But he is in this particular text. So passing on that legacy is, in a certain way, different than I think it is now in terms of the power of passing on blessings and legacies that existed in ancient times. And I think that we're reading this with 21st century eyes, and part of it is looking back also and understanding how that worked also in ancient times. The power of that blessing we see it biblically. We see it all over the Near East, the ancient Middle East. Very different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really powerful things he does here is to bless each child as their own blessing. But I also find it very interesting, the ancient versus the modern here. Dan, thank you for pulling that out, in that when all of you, look at your children, right, there's a temptation. Do we name who they are, or do we name who we believe they can be? And Jacob really in this moment is calling out who they have been and maybe who they even are to this day. And it's not until he gets really to Joseph, although one could argue that even Joseph's blessing is not so lovely here, right? It's not until he gets to Joseph's children and into, the idea of Joseph with a crown on his head that he kind of moves into a place where he's imagining what essence his children have that they could grow to become. And I think that's a really important parenting question. How much do we place before our children? Look, you've got this material inside of you. If you develop it, if you water it, if you grow it, you can become X, Y, or Z.
Right, but that also it's related to the original question that Alisa posted and nobody's answering.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I feel like I should honor your question. What do we do when our kids grow up to be completely different to what we aspire or what we wished? And so I don't have adult kids. I still have teenagers, and in a way you are able to shape them more while they are still at home. But at some point, if they end up being whatever they end up being, you have to come to peace with that and accept them the way they are and love them as much as and support them as much as you can. So you try to shape them, you try them to guide them, and you point them in the right direction. But then eventually they will have to be the one making the decisions. So. That answers a little bit your question? Okay, good. We'll see eventually.
Thank you.
We should meet in a couple of years to see what you're thinking.
No, I always feel like this is like also my sleuthing. Like, can I ask more parenting questions and avoid the text? Can I get some insider tips? Do you have any other advice I should think about?
No, I was thinking when you were mentioning something, I was thinking also about that for better or for worse, we as parents, our kids are going to remember wonderful things and things that are not that wonderful, all right? And eventually, they are going to blame us for some things that we have no idea. And perhaps some of you have experience with that. So the question is, how much Jacob is wounded by the way that Isaac treated him as a son? And if he's able or not to, move on, or actually that's exactly the same type of parenting he's doing with his own kids because he was wounded as with the blessings and all the things that he needed to do.
Right, and what does it take to make a different choice? Like it's much easier to just perpetuate whatever you grew up with and just do what you experienced. What does it take to make that shift?
Well, I will say there is a difference, because when Jacob steals the blessing from Esau, Isaac says, when Esau comes back, he says, I don't have another blessing, right? There's just one blessing. And then he has to kind of dig in himself. He's, all right, fine, maybe I'll find a blessing for you. And it seems like on some level, at least Jacob here has understood that he has a blessing for each child, even though they might be challenging ones.
I was going to say, if I had a nickel for every time that I'm blamed for something that I have absolutely no recollection of. Do you remember when I was 1.5 years old and you did this? No. Well, it's a really good point,
I know my kids are going to blame me because they make fun of me in Spanish. That
as though you don't understand.
They do a deep voice imitating me, and they say in Spanish, "I don't know. Ask your mom." So that's what they always tell me. So I know it. I know that's coming back.
So I'm like so intrigued. This is also so funny because Solomon and I had this conversation that night, and he was like, I think we should start ordering parenting books. We only have about 4 more months to learn everything there is, and then our brains are going to be fried. And I was like, I can't do parenting books. I'm just doing books on sleeping and feeding. That's enough. I haven't figured out a philosophy yet.
You'll grow into it.
We haven't even talked about that today. Okay. But we're going to move along because I want to make sure that we have time to think about the grandparenting. And there's an interesting shift that happens. My Rebbe, Rav Zalman Schachter Shalom Yalav Shalom, used to say that grandparents and children and grandchildren have a very special connection because they're both united against the parents. Yes, common enemy. And so I want to ask in this, when it comes to Jacob. Now we don't actually see a lot of grandparenting in the Torah, but this is an example of grandparenting that we see in kind of a sweet, mischievous example of grandparenting. Dan, would you read chapter 48 on page 4? We'll just read those first verses until verse 16. So.
Now it came to pass after these incidents that someone said to Joseph, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took his 2 sons with him, Manasseh and Ephraim. And now, as for your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, until I came to you to the land of Egypt, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine like Reuven and Shimon. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim at his right and from Israel's left, and Manasseh at his left from Israel's right, and he brought them near to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and placed it on Ephraim's head, although he was the youngest, and his left hand he placed on Manasseh's head. He guided his hands deliberately, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, God who sustained me as long as I am alive until this day, may the angel who redeemed me from all harm bless the youths, and may they be called by my name and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they multiply abundantly like fish in the midst of the land."
And beautifully, we're missing this scene. There's part of the scene where he puts out his hands, and Joseph's like, "Dad, wrong kid. Switch your hands." And he's like, No. This is intentional. I'm doing this intentionally. So, yes, exactly.
But we see it reflected here in the fact that you have Manasseh and Ephraim in verse 1, and then he calls, Jacob says, "No, Ephraim and Manasseh."
So what do you make of this grandfatherly moment? How do you see this moment?
There's so much complexity in this. I feel like now all of us are in your chair. And we need to reach out there for some grandparenting experts. But I think that there's this amazing thing that happens here that ought to be noted. There's a huge amount that's made out of the fact that Jacob seems to have learned nothing in his life and continues to do the younger over the older. And it's this whole big thing that his adult son has an issue with him about. I mean, there's psychologists here could really dig into that missing scene that we have, because Joseph says, "Wait a minute, haven't you learned anything? The younger over the older, that didn't work. That threw me into a pit. I was in slavery. Could we please break this chain already?" And Jacob says, no, I'm doing this intentionally, and I mean to continue on this idea of the younger over the older, and we could dig in there if we wanted to. But what's fascinating is he says he's going to give these blessings, but then actually he winds up giving them the same blessing, which I think there's something there.
What?
So I think it is that special grandparenting. I do think there's something that kind of mellows in that there's just a capacity for love without the same kind of criticism, that there's a desire to plant eternity in your grandchildren. Right? What is it? The angel who guarded me should be with you. A sense of wanting to pass on something that will be shiny and bright and loving and caring. And even though he does it within the context of this younger over the older, we know famously that Ephraim and Manasseh get along. Like somehow, something in that moment, either who they are when they came there, or how Jacob eventually did bless them with that same blessing, enables them just to be okay with each other, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, there are so many things that are fascinating about this, even before to the point of getting to the blessing. Then you're an expert here, Lord Nelson. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no
You're
place in the Torah before this where Jacob blesses the 11 other kids' sons.
Yeah,
all right?
That's true. Yeah,
That's
it's
true.
not,
So he chooses only to bless these two grandchildren.
Right.
Why is that? So terrible. Bad parenting and bad grandparenting. Okay?
Has
To begin
nothing to
with.
do with his
you're
mother.
thinking of all of who knows how many grandchildren.
Right,
who are
but
not
why
in that
the
moment.
Torah doesn't mention anything? That because it's irrelevant, or because Jacob never did bless all the other grandchildren? Okay? So bad thing. He's already making a bad choice over there. I don't like Jacob at all. I don't know if you can tell. Okay, never like anything about him. So that's number one. Second is, it's so funny how women are completely out of this story here. First of all, Dinah, where is Dinah? She's the 13th daughter, nothing, not even a mention. And now this verse that it says, I want to adopt them, my grandchildren. What about the wife of Joseph? It's like, what? Oh, yeah, sure, take them. It doesn't matter. They are bad kids, so take them anyways. So nothing, absolutely nothing. So two things that are fantastic. And then explain to me. So famously on Friday nights, we bless our kids. We put our hands on top of the heads and we say, Yesim Elohim Kefraim Bechi Menashe. And then we say, Yesimech Elohim Kesara Rivka Rachel Belea. So we are not comparing patriarchs and matriarchs. We are doing Ephraim and Menashe with the matriarchs. Why is that?
So my favorite answer to that is that they are the first ones in all of Jewish history that have this move that should be putting them against each other. And by the way, every other generation that it happens, it causes tremendous dissension. And Ephraim and Manasseh look at each other and they say, hey, mazel tov, brother. Okay, yeah, mazel tov to you too. And nothing happens. There's no fighting, there's no anger, there's no hatred. And when we bless our children, we want our children to be people like that, people who can love their brother regardless of what else happens in life to pit them apart.
Yeah, that is beautiful. I love it.
But
the blessing doesn't make any sense because you are blessing your kids as two brothers that get along, but then you go to the matriarchs. What does it have? Do they get along? They are completely different generations. What is the point?
I think the answer has to do with people that are they are choosing outside of the norm. In other words, Ephraim and Manasseh are born outside of
Which key is that?
They are outside the land of Israel. I mean, they kind of have no choice. They're first Jewish kids that are born, in a sense, not in the land of Israel, and so they grow up in a whole different world. And Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah, they also, even though they have chosen to be with their partners, they're brought along on the journey. So these six people are brought along on the journey. That could be one interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a good answer to this one. I mean, our tradition doesn't tend to do very well with blessings for women in general,
Yeah,
and
that's
so
true,
I
yeah.
think that the women, the matriarchs are, they were the women around to bless you with.
tough pickings.
So,
I want to come back to, there's one other thing that's puzzled me, which is that the first curse/blessing, depending on how you interpret it, that Jacob gives out is to Reuven and Shimon and Levi. And those are some of the nastiest blessings. He's like, you could have been great, but you didn't. Right? That was his blessing for Reuven, was like, you could have done it, but you screwed up. And then Shimon is like, you were violent, you're right. So he has these curses for them. And then the thing that is always fascinating me, he says they'll be mine like Reuben and Shimon. Why?
I think it's they'll be mine instead of Reuben and Shimon.
Oof.
Right? In a sense, I need to
don't make it
replace.
worse, please.
No, really. I mean, I do think that there's some level at which they come in. Reuven and Shimon would have been precious to me in that way. They have been pushed aside, and I'm needing more in my lineage. And Ephraim and Manasseh come in there.
Could it be that he says, I'm turning into you now? Could it be
Oh,
that...
are you defending Jacob?
Yes. Could it be that he says, I wasn't a good parent of Reuben and Shimon, and I'm going to try with these two?
I mean, I love that. That's beautiful. And I also love the position that you've just gotten yourself into here.
Say more.
But I particularly love the idea because we see it all the time. We see it with grandparents who say, you know, hey, first time around, I didn't play ball with my kid. I was too busy. And with my grandkid, I'm going to make sure I'm out there at every ball game because I know that that's important. So yes, absolutely. I think it's borne out in our real lived experience. And I think there's another piece of the pathos of Ephraim and Manasseh that is so powerful, and it has to do with, Dan, what you named, which is that they grew up in Egypt in the Egyptian court. You know, it's not like they're going to shul every week, right? And how many grandparents, who raised your kids however you raised your kids and, took them skiing on the weekends or whatever it was. Ralph, you have an amazing story about that, who then later on with their grandparents, when their grandchildren realize, oh, wait a minute, right? Like they're pretty far from this Jewish tradition that I had been gifted myself, and I need to now make an investment so that the next generation has an experience of what it is to be Jewish that their own parents, my children that I raised in a different way, are not necessarily doing, and therefore I need to bring in more tradition. We got to come around Bubby's kitchen and make sure that we're making the kugel, and what is it that I'm giving as a grandparent that might be different than what I gave as a parent.
What's interesting also after this blessing is that then we don't really have any more parenting or grandparenting stories after this, right? The next sort of familial story we have is Moshe, and he's born in such a time that he's abandoned and given up to nature, and there's a new kind of parenting, which is the sort of the village parenting, where there's lots of people in the kitchen, lots of people helping out. What are the lessons that we take from this? Like if you were me, not to make this personal, but if you were me and you were looking at this text to say, what are the parenting or grandparenting lessons that I can take from Tanakh? What would be your takeaway from Jacob, from Joseph, from these blessings? What is one distilled vision for what our Torah teaches us about how to be the best parents we can be?
I think
I have to go to services.
No, I think it's what Michelle has been saying all along, that we need to be able to take as well as being totally involved, we need to also take a step back and look at our children to see exactly who they are, and differentiate between who we want them to become and the encouragement to let them become who they are. I think that's part of it. And also, it is very complex because we are caught in our own emotions in our own daily lives, where things just happen all the time, and it's very, very difficult to take a step back in the moment and say, if I say this, if I do this at this time, how might that affect my child 10 years, 15 years from now, when they 30, 20 years from now, when they become parents, and they're going to remember, this is what my mom or my dad said, and this is something I don't ever want to do, or I learned something so important as a role model. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, one thing that it's clear to me is that not only because of this, but our own experience is that we all try our best. Okay, I don't think there is, could be, but the majority of people in the world, they want to be good parents. That's for sure. whether or not you end up being a good parent, it has so much of the baggage you're bringing, the way you were raised, and there are so many things that, how well you get along with your spouse, and there are so many other things that could affect that. But ultimately, everybody wants the best for the kids. And in a way, it's not fair to say, okay, after 15 years of you've done being a parent, they say, okay, oh, I could have done this better. Of course, we are all going to have regrets. One thing that always stands out for me is the idea of regardless of how harsh is the message that you give them for them to do better, to try to be balanced in the way I treat them both, or 5 like you have, or 6. I don't know how many kids you have. Try to be balanced, not to make difference. I treat you much better than this one because that one speaks more to my heart. That's bad.
Yeah, at the end of this Mea Shiloach that is here in the text on page 4, it says, that's why the text doesn't initially say Jacob blessed his sons, for he still wasn't sure what he was going to say to them. And I kind of love that idea about parenting, that even at your last moment, right, at every moment, you bring your authentic self into that space in an encounter with your particular child. And what comes out of that moment will be what comes authentically in that moment. And if I could bless you as a parent, Eliza, it would be that you should be able, like Jacob here, to meet your child authentically and parent in the way that emerges most authentically from yourself as called by God to respond to your child in that moment.
That means while I
should
cry,
like
will you
that.
sing a song?
So let's use this beautiful blessing at the end, Amalach HaGoel, and we'll sing that. Yesimech Elohim k'Mishel, West Den Elias. All right. Amalach HaGoel oti, Amalach HaGoel oti mikol ra, Yebarech et hane'arim, ve'karem lahem shemi. Amalach HaGoel oti, Amalach HaGoel oti mikol ra, Yevarech et hane'arim, ve'karem lahem shemi. V'shem avotai, v'shem avotai,